So my name is Jeremy Bailenson, and thank you for that lovely introduction. It's an honor to be here, and I'm delighted to talk to you guys today. My PhD is actually in psychology. So in 1999, I got a degree in cognitive psychology, where I learned how to run experiments and how to map out areas of the mind. I then switched fields, and I got a postdoc at UC Santa Barbara, where I learned how to do the engineering to build the hardware and the software programming to make immersive virtual reality. And so I was there for 4 years. And in 2003, I was lucky enough to get a job here at Stanford, where what I do, I'm a professor in the Department of Communication, where we study media. And my job is to build VR and to study how it affects the mind. But most relevant to today's conversation, really to look at the applications of virtual reality. Are we ready, sir? Good. Okay, show of hands. How many of you guys have been in virtual reality and walked around? Actually walked, not just looked. About 30 of you. So feel free to call out. I'm going to play you this video, and I want to tell me what this guy is doing. He is walking the plank. Thank you. So what he's seeing is a 3D model of the room. It looks just like the room. And we've dropped a 10-meter chasm right in front of him. So there's an edge, and it's 10 meters deep. And we put a really rickety plank across the chasm, and he's got to walk across that chasm. Now, let's take a step back to the year 2001. I went to Washington, D.C., and I presented my VR system, the 15-year-old version of what I have now, to the federal government, in particular the Federal Judicial Center. We were there to talk about how to use VR to analyze crime scenes, how to do eyewitness testimony. And I had a federal judge. He was probably in his late 60s, about 260 pounds, a big guy. And when he was walking across that plank, he just stepped a little bit to the left, and he fell off the plank, and we modeled gravity, and he plummeted down in virtual reality. Now, if you were in the physical world, and you fell off that plank, and you wanted to save your life, what would you do? The answer is you would dive at a 45-degree angle to try to catch the edge, the other side of the chasm. And that's what this judge did in the physical world. He dove at a 45-degree angle in the physical world. Now, this is my first public demo. I'm now very prepared for this type of an event, but it turns out there was a sharp corner on a table. And as he dove, his face was going right for this sharp corner. And my one move as a 26-year-old postdoc was to dive at him and knock his direction so he didn't hit his face against. Anyway, he's fine. And nobody got sued. I didn't go to jail, so everything's fine. But this is what we call presence. When VR is done well, there's no gadgets, there's no pixels, there's no interface. You're just there. It's an experience. And so for the rest of this talk, if there's one thing that you'll learn, if you, in your business, think about VR not as a media experience, but as an actual experience, that'll help you think of the applications. So this is my lab. It is arguably the best VR lab on the planet from a technological standpoint. We have a great tracking system that can track your movements down to 1/10 of a millimeter. We have a floor that shakes. We've got spatialized sound that can move sound throughout the room with a 24-channel ambisonic system. We've got virtual smell. It's a destination for heads of state, for CEOs, for the military and NASA. All that being said, my lab is becoming obsolete, because for a guy who's been doing this for 20 years, the consumer market is now catching up. So I'll tell a story. In March 2014, my second daughter was due. Her name's Edie. And 2 weeks before Edie was born, Mark Zuckerberg came to the lab. He spent 3 hours with us doing VR, talking about the applications we're going to talk about today. 2 weeks later, Zuckerberg buys this tiny little company no one's heard of called Oculus for what we now know to be $3 billion. And the New York Times runs an article on the front page of the business section saying, visit to Bailenson's lab was in part responsible for Zuck's decision to buy Oculus. And from that moment on, you can see the bags under my eyes. I've been working 16-hour days because I've chosen to engage with all the companies that are working in VR to really help them think about their VR strategy. So I work with lots of different companies, including the ones you see here. And the thing to remember is that it used to be the case when you look on your right side of this image, the helmets I used to use used to cost $40,000, more than my car. The ones we're using today now cost $300. So we're at the point now where you can use this in B2B and B2C applications. But why I'm here today, I'm not an engineer. I do some engineering, but for the most part, my strength is figuring out what to do. This is my grandfather. He's 91 years old. And when I finally put the head-mounted display on him, he looked around for a second and he said, well, what do I do in here? And a lot of you in this room, the ones you said you've tried VR, you've probably had this reaction. This is really cool, but I'm not really sure how I would use this tomorrow. And so the rest of the talk, we're going to talk about ways that we use it tomorrow. VR is not for everything. I'm going to be very depressed if in 3 years from now, everybody's walking around wearing helmets, reading their email. VR is for really special experiences, and I want to keep it for that. I'll give you some examples. In 2003, one of the first grants I got as an academic was from Cisco, and a brilliant woman named Marcia Satowski at Cisco. She said, Jeremy, the way we do diversity training now, it's, you read about case studies, or, we've got some software that'll kind of give you some rules, but it really doesn't change the way you think. So this is a movie that's now over a decade old, and it leverages something called body transfer. The neuroscientists have proven that if you see a virtual image in a mirror, and for 4 minutes you move around, and your mirror image moves with you, so he's a white male, walks to the mirror. When he moves his head, the avatar's head moves with him. And so we do this for 4 minutes, and the neuroscientists call this body transfer. The brain actually expands its schema to believe that the other self in the mirror is you. He bends down, I hit a button, and now he's a woman of color. Okay, so we transform your identity. We then repeat this body transfer so it feels like it's you in the mirror. You then turn around, and when you turn around, there's another person networked into VR with you, and that person proceeds to be very horrible to you. He says and does things to you that's related to your race, your gender, and you experience prejudice firsthand. So for 15 years, we've been publishing studies showing that this body transfer prejudice changes attitudes and behavior more than the typical control conditions like role-playing or reading or watching movies. But the neat thing for me is that now we can scale this up. So this is Roger Goodell. He's the commissioner of the National Football League, which is, I know not everybody loves American football, but it's a very large company in the United States. It's a huge organization. And he came to the lab because as an organization, he wanted the NFL to be leaders in how they taught tolerance diversity training. So I'm delighted to announce that as of 5 weeks ago, something we've been working on for a long time, it's an interview trainer where you have NFL executives sitting across from a person that they're interviewing. And as they interview, we record everything and give them feedback about, well, where were they looking? What did they say? How did you treat a white guy differently than someone who's African American? And what we can do is basically give you trial and error learning and to teach you how to overcome your own biases. The next line of studies I'll talk about deals with the future. So there is a famous philosopher, Parfit, who's long argued that humans were really good at imagining pleasure right now. All of you can, you're going to go to a nice dinner tonight, you're going to go and get a beer, it's going to be great, but we're really bad at imagining pain in the future. Okay? So if you want someone to plan well for the future, how do you get them to really connect psychologically to their future self? So this work was done in collaboration with Laura Karstensen and her graduate student Hal Hirschfield. They really cared about saving money. So the actuarial math folks have proven that the 20-somethings in the United States are going to be destitute when they're 70 because they're not putting money in the bank. How do you get someone to defer gratification, not spend money now, but to get them to connect psychologically to the future? The answer is you have somebody walk up to that mirror and they meet their future self, meaning we build a model of their face, we scan their face, and then we use algorithms to show them how they're going to look when they're 70 years old, so they get a face-to-face meeting with their future self and they become older. What we then do is we give them an opportunity to have some money now or more money later if they take that money and put it in a savings account. No undergrads want to do this. When you're 20, you want that money now. You need money. It's hard to save money when you're that age. In our experiments, which we published in a good academic journal, this was Hal's dissertation, about a dozen experiments, showed that when you meet your future self, you become older in VR compared to just about every control condition you can think of. This causes you to put money in the bank. You actually defer gratification. So we published this result. And again, the fun thing for me now is that the big companies, we can actually scale our work out. One of the wonderful things about being at Stanford as a social scientist, a lot of universities, they don't want you to you can't work with companies. Here we're encouraged to do work that changes the world in a good way. So Bank of America was the first group to figure out how to implement this. Using your laptop's camera, they figured out a way to scan your face, and then they aged your face, so there's a version of your future self, and as part of your banking interface, if you download something called Face Retirement, your future self stares you in the face while you make every financial decision that's relevant. And the more money you put in savings, the happier your future self gets, okay? And this is in the land of win-wins. The 20-somethings are not going to be destitute when they're 65. Bank of America gets a little bit more money in the bank. It's a great win-win. Sunju An is a PhD student who's now a professor at University of Georgia. Her dissertation was on something called self-endorsing, which is when you have an endorser for a product, we try to match the endorser to the demographic. You can make age, gender, things of that nature. Grace decided to build what you'd probably seen in science fiction movies. Imagine you're walking down the aisle at a shopping mall. Your body gets scanned at point 1. 50 meters later, there's a huge billboard, and there's you using a product you've never used before. And beautiful people love you because you're using that product. It's called self-endorsing. And what Grace did was publish a lot of academic studies in the Journal of Advertising showing that this causes better brand retention, people like the product more, and most importantly, that people don't get pissed off by this. So you can imagine some people feeling violated. Her data didn't show that that occurred. The engineer at the time who did the work to make Grace's dissertation happen was a woman named Maria Jabin. Maria went to LinkedIn right after leaving the lab, and she built for LinkedIn something called Picture Yourself, which all it did, this is a few years old now, was scrape the web to get a photo of the user, stick the user next to a job description and say, picture yourself as the CEO of this company. According to Maria, this caused 5 times more click-through than anything else they ever tried in the history of LinkedIn, an extremely successful tool to get people to pay attention to their materials. And arguably what's the first B2B success, the business-to-business success in virtual reality, Derek Belch, he was a field goal kicker on the Stanford football team in 2005, and he took my class Virtual People, which is a class about virtual reality. He said, Jeremy, can we use VR to train athletes? I said, Derek, it's a brilliant idea, but the technology's not ready yet. Come back in a decade. 10 years later, in 2014, Derek comes to my lab. He does his master's thesis in my lab while he's an assistant coach on the Stanford team. And he convinces Coach Shaw, who's the coach of our football team, to give us 5 minutes of practice time on Monday. What we did on Monday is we dragged this heavy rig out there that was a bunch of cameras facing outward that could produce what's now easily known as spherical video. Back then, this was very difficult to do. And what we would do is we'd have our defense simulate the plays that the team we were going to play on Saturday would be doing. So the defense would pretend to be the other team. We'd capture the scene in virtual reality for about 5 minutes of practice on Mondays. We'd go back to the lab. We stitched everything together, made these things work in VR. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, the players, the quarterback, the running backs, and some offensive linemen would run through the plays. Now, we're not teaching them how to throw or run or kick. They already know how to do that. We're giving them extra mental repetitions. Okay, players have a lot of times to work on their athletics, but being in the game under this high-stress situation and being forced to make a decision for a quarterback, it's do you keep the play that you have or do you change the play based on what you read in the defense? So it's basically see a complex pattern, make a decision, and execute it. And what we would do is we'd give them hundreds and hundreds of extra mental repetitions off the field. After 3 weeks, Coach Shaw makes it mandatory for all the players, and Kevin Hogan, who is our quarterback that season, he'll be the one to tell you, we try not to take credit for our player success, that this caused him to have the 4 best games of his career. Literally, there's plays that he would practice in virtual reality, and then when he got onto the field, it would be just like he was there, and he would say as much. Now, typical Stanford style, Derek graduates January 2nd, 2015. January 3rd, he forms a startup. It's called Striver, and Striver is literally changing the way that athletes train. There's about 7 NFL teams using it, about 15 major college programs, 2 baseball teams, 3 hockey teams. U.S. soccer is using it. Another national soccer team is using it. It is an invaluable tool to give you the extra practice and mental repetition that you need. Now, that was in 2016, really success in training athletes. What's happened in the last few months is it turns out the skills that I just described for a quarterback, quick scanning of a scene, making a decision, and being able to practice without hurting anybody or without making expensive waste, that's relevant to just about all of your jobs you're thinking about applications. And so I'm working with one of the largest retailers in the world to imagine you're at the deli counter and you're trying to teach your employee how to detect that sharp knife that's left out, or to look a customer in the eye when there's a long line. Or if you're a manager of a company and you've got to have a difficult conversation, being able to practice hiring or firing conversations when you're not threatening a lawsuit by saying the wrong thing. So everything we learned about quarterbacks, high-impact people that don't have a lot of time to train, you want standardized training, it applies to just about every other job. And it's been really fun watching everything we've learned about training athletes apply to everything from CEOs down to the people who are at the checkout counter at a major retailer. The final thing I'll leave you at is the future of communication. So I'm going to meet some of you today after this talk, and we're going to get to shake hands, and that's delightful. I'm not saying we should replace face-to-face communication. However, for 20 years, I've dedicated my career to trying to make better communication systems so that you can feel as if you're there, get what we call social presence. You know, we know that video conferencing is not good enough to really get the handshake. The question is, when can I make my technology good enough such that we don't have to do this little thing we call commute, okay? I want us to travel when we have to, but, I want us to travel when we want to, but not when we have to. And this idea that we all get in boxes and drive in those boxes an hour each way every day, I want to look back 5 years and 10 years maybe and say, could you imagine that we did that? How ridiculous is it that 1.3 million people die in car accidents worldwide each year? It's probably, when you talk about the best applications of VR, if we can perfect the communication system, we can solve climate change, we can solve all sorts of things. So on that note, I look forward to your questions. VR, the technology's here. Think of VR as a real experience, and I hope I can talk to you to figure out how it can help your business.
Thanks, Jeremy. Any questions? Let's start there, on your left.
Thanks very much. So in terms of areas of mental disorder, or right now we're going through an opioids epidemic and addiction, have you looked at application of VR in that area?
So the question is, can we use VR to combat opioid addiction? And I just threw a conference in Los Angeles. It was called VR Pain 2016, the worst kept secret in VR, and I call it the worst kept secret because it shouldn't be a secret. There's been over 100 published studies that show that VR, it's so distracting that presence in the virtual world translates to absence in the physical world. The distraction is so deep that it takes you out of your body. So the first person to ever study this, Hunter Hoffman, in the mid-90s at the University of Washington, took veterans coming back from the Iraq War. When you have to change their bandages on a burn wound, it's horribly painful. Opioids don't even combat it. VR has been shown to reduce that pain by up to 70% since the subjective experience of pain. Since that landmark study, hundreds of studies, including randomized trials showing that VR reduces pain. The purpose of the conference that I threw in 2016 was to try to get people whose job it is to do insurance reimbursement, people from the FDA, alongside the best academics so that we could try to get this out of the laboratory and into mainstream. I think it's, I give an hour-long talk just on VR and pain. It's one of the great apps.
More questions? I find this hard to believe. There must be more questions. All right, we will ask you during the break. Thank you so much, Jeremy.